Hello, everyone, and welcome to Digital Dragons 2020. My name is Paweł Kroenke. I'm lead narrative designer at Arkane Lyon, and I'm recording from home because of the whole situation in the world. So today we are talking about Don't Believe What You Think, which is actually a talk about narrative prototyping. So let me just say quickly 2 words about me. I started in 2013 at Creative Forge Games in Warsaw, and I worked on virtually all the projects up to and including Phantom Doctrine, and I was working on the narrative in Hard West, its DLC, and Phantom Doctrine itself, where it was my main focus. And in 2019, I joined Arkane Lyon to work on Deathloop, and that's it. So let's get into it. And as I said, we are talking about prototyping the narrative. And this is something that I found extremely useful because of how the games are made. All the elements are being developed at roughly the same time. So you've got systems developed at the same time as levels and the narrative as well. So when you need to make big decisions about narrative, the game is usually not there yet. You cannot play the game from start to finish. You maybe can play a level, which is like on white boxes, and there are maybe some basic systems, or maybe there are some systems that you borrowed from the previous game that you were making. But you don't really have like a fully fledged structure of the campaign or the game that you can beat from start to finish. You don't really have the progression. So it's really difficult to make decisions about the narrative and just to say whether it works or not. So, of course, you cover a lot of ground by following the basics of storytelling, which you make sure that you have enough conflict, that you have characters that can play off one another, that you're throwing enough obstacles at the protagonist, and that you stick to your themes. But results may vary. This is not always, what looks good on paper doesn't always work quite as well in the game. And so by making a narrative prototype, you are reducing the guesswork and the things that you think should work, but don't know for sure, don't have already any data except for your gut feeling and your experience to guide you to say whether it's something is going to work or not. And such a narrative prototype is designed to give you some information that you can base on. You can test some of your assumptions and see where this works. So don't just believe what you think is going to work. Try if it works, see if it works. And I have 2 caveats for this talk. So one, this is probably not very relevant if you are making a story-driven narrative experience, which is linear, because in this case, you probably don't need like a big fancy prototype. You just write the script, and the pacing of the script informs a little bit more the pacing of the game, more than in the case of a game which is like gameplay driven, or I don't know, something else driven, and where the narrative is like a secondary thing that is subservient to the bigger game. And I am not talking here about prototyping narrative features, because these would be like any other gameplay prototypes. And I will be talking about the overall story prototype. So the way we're going to approach this is we're going to cover some of the bases of prototyping and how it relates. I'm going to give you examples of 2 such narrative prototypes that I've done for the project I was involved in. This will not be a postmortem. I will not be going into very much detail. I will mostly use those as springboards to tell you what I've learned from those experiences and how I would approach making a new prototype. There is also the subject where these prototypes turned out to be pretty useful, not just for narrative designers, but for our disciplines as well. So we're going to talk about that. And then I'm going to show you the model of how you could approach making a prototype like that. And I will show you an example of a prototype for a game that already came out that you should be familiar with. And from there, we will go to conclusions, and that's going to be. And of course, outside of the video, you will be able to ask me some questions if you have them during the live Q&A session. So just generally about prototypes. So narrative prototypes that test the whole progression of the game are prototypes, and they should be approached as with the same methodology. So you should make sure that your prototype is cheap, that you don't need like any super fancy tools where you need to spend like loads on them, or that you involve 10 people from your team to make this prototype. They should be fast, so it's not like so it's really a tool that helps you and not like you're not something that doesn't really detract you from making the actual game. They should use tech that is familiar to you. So just pick a tool that you know well, that is not necessarily the tool that your game is running on, not necessarily the engine, just something that you know well and that is suited for your purpose. And your prototype should be focused. So it should be designed to answer specific questions and not go beyond that, just not to waste time, just to keep it, make sure that you are being fast and cheap. And as I mentioned before, for a couple of times, I guess already, this is not about prototyping narrative systems. This is about prototyping the overall progression of the story. So like maybe kind of simulate the narrative experience, if you will. So the goals for this prototype is to find out at what rate you are getting plot information and identify any structural conflicts that you may have. Like, for instance, you can do something that will invalidate another step in the progression that you haven't hit yet. And by doing these two things, we may hope to get more, and maybe we should be able to estimate the longevity of our project or of your story, assess the pacing and the content distribution, double check on content scope, see if maybe if you have this kind of pacing in a game and it takes you this amount of time, maybe you should like put more stuff in, or maybe you can do away with some of the stuff and do less. And this is all very useful information. And there's more, really. It really depends on the project and how your prototype is shaping up. So let's talk about some examples. And the first prototype that I've made that was designed to test the whole progression of the game was for Phantom Doctrine. And if you are not familiar with the project, it's a turn-based tactical. It has a linear single-player campaign, and that is pretty long. It's about 40 hours long, but you could even play longer if you do a lot of side content. And despite being linear, it has some conditional stuff. So depending on the background of your character that you choose, some content will change. And if you beat the game at least once, you unlock this extended story mode, which has more information, more background events, and well, it's a denser narrative experience. So the prototype was listed all of the narrative events in the game, like every single one. It was a giant Excel file that looked somewhat like this. And you can see kind of in the upper part, you could select your background and out of the 3 available backgrounds, you could also select the playthrough, whether regular or expanded, and that would change the content that is displayed. And in the column on the left, you had the narrative device that was used, so either like a cutscene or a dialogue or something else. And in the middle was a description of what is happening at this point in the game. So it was this Excel file with this conditional data, and then that had actually an overlapping function, because it was not only a prototype of the whole story to see how it flows, but it was also a production list. So because it listed every single event in the game, so it was it would inform how I would structure my scripts, and I could quickly look up what kind of event triggers certain type of information fairly quickly. So let's look at the pros of, so like I said, it was a useful reference. It contained all of the narrative events in the game, and that proved very helpful. It had this content filtering options, so I was only looking at the content that I was interested in and didn't have to like look through some if statements, like if you have this background and this is this kind of playthrough, then you only get this event, but if it's another, then something else happens. So this was filtered. It was very convenient, and that was a very long lasting, but I was basically using it until the very end of production. So that was good. And as for cons, it was completely unwieldy. This was like this giant Excel file, very difficult to navigate. It took forever to make. Like listing all the events was extremely time consuming, and I had to make decisions about some things that I maybe wasn't yet ready to make decisions about. And because of how it was structured, it was also very difficult to edit, because if I wanted to add an event at a certain background but not another one, then it would mess up the order of how content is displayed, and it would create conflicts. It was pretty horrible. It was pretty unclear, because for anybody that wasn't me, basically, there was a lot of reading, and voila. A lot of reading, and the format wasn't, I mean, it was fairly easy to follow, but finding like a specific information quickly was very difficult. And it was not possible to print it because of how big this Excel file was. And it wasn't very presentable, because if you put it on a big screen, it had plenty of tiny text, which was completely unreadable in a group setting, so not very good for intent. However, even though it was a pretty shitty prototype, it proved to be useful, and I'm really glad that I had it, because if I didn't have it, I don't even want to think what would happen. So my lessons from this prototype is that smaller is better, usually. So maybe I shouldn't, I probably shouldn't have made that a production list. Maybe if I just listed like the most important events, it would be a lot more clear, and more people would be able to use it and make any sense of it. Or maybe I should have done like a part of the game and then extrapolate for the rest of it. But in any case, start smaller. I learned that if you have horrible UX, then nobody is gonna want to use your prototype, because it will be just so uncomfortable, and like getting into it would be such a pain that it basically decreases the usefulness of your prototype. And I realized that, after a while, that if your prototype takes a long time to make, like several weeks or something, maybe your story is too big, which actually would have been a big success of this prototype if if I took the hint, I guess. So maybe you have too much stuff, or maybe you're using the wrong tools, and they're just not good for this kind of prototype. Or maybe your prototype is too detailed. Maybe you have too much information in there. Maybe you can do with less. just to get a sense of how the story is flowing. So then I joined Arkane, and I'm working on Deathloop. And this is a game that is still in development, so I'm afraid I won't be able to reveal a lot about it. But you will see how this first prototype helped create a better one for Deathloop. So for anyone who is not familiar with the game, this is a first-person shooter. It's an Arkane style game through and through, so it has a lot of the elements that you would associate with an Arkane game. It has a lot of player agency, and it has a multiplayer component. So it's a really challenging setting for the narrative. And this second prototype that I was doing, Arkane, it actually started as a feature prototype. So it wasn't supposed to be like this global overview of the story. At the beginning, it was supposed to just simulate one of the narrative features. And at first, we thought about making it on paper because, we watched all those great talks in GDC and elsewhere. Which tell you like, oh, if you can do so much stuff with paper and it's so fun, and you make this great prototype of your game with just paper and it's so low tech and so jazzy and everything. Actually, it turned out to be horrible. So we made this first version, and this prototype of the prototype was soon fed to Bob Sliceman, which is what we call our shredder. And instead we used Twine. So if you're not familiar with Twine, it's a tool that lets you write choose your own adventure style games very efficiently. You just type in your text, and with some simple markup, you can put like hyperlinks to other nodes, and you can track some variables and do if statements and stuff like that. So it looks a bit like what you see on the screen. So you have a bit of text, and you have some options that you can choose. If you choose an option, it sends you to a different node. So this is a view of the Twine tool, where you get all the nodes and their connections between them, and this just illustrates how all the nodes are connected. And you edit the nodes by just opening, you type in your text, and there are some specific commands that are very easy to learn that you can use to create those hyperlinks and do all sorts of stuff with the text. So this is not from the prototype I was talking about. It's from another project. So Twine, and by expanding this Twine simulation, we actually got to create the complete game. We put in all the game progression as it was at the time. It had a list of actions, like all the things that you could do in the game that influenced the narrative in some way. And by inputting the actions that you've done, the script would analyze them and would output the narrative content that was relevant to what you were doing. And this is how we were testing whether it works, what kind of conditions we need to use to enable this content, and stuff like that. So it was actually fairly fast to make. I think it took me about like 2 weeks and change to get like this big version working. And it was like virtually a day, maybe, or 2 days to have the basic thing going. It was very fast to use as well. So you could complete a playthrough of the game in like 15, 20 minutes. And so you could test a lot of different scenarios. It was very effective at this. It was easy to use because you had this very good UI where you just have a bit of text and then you pick some options. It was self-explanatory. Everybody understood it immediately. It was easy to present because you have big text on a screen, so you can easily put it up on the big screen. It's legible, and also it's an HTML file, so you can send it to everywhere and everything, open in any browser. It's really easy to use. And this whole prototype, the structure of it turned out to be very versatile, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. There were some cons, obviously. So as I said, for the whole version, it took me like 2 weeks and change, and then I had to update the tool as well. So it wasn't maybe like 1 day prototype or something, and it was difficult to update as well because Twine has some limitations, and when you want to change the architecture a little bit of the project, it becomes a bit more difficult, especially with some of the things that I've done, which I think Twine wasn't really designed for. But overall, it was a very good prototype and a big improvement over the previous one. So some of the highlights from the use of this prototype. As I was scripting the things, it already revealed some sequencing conflicts. So we haven't identified before, just working with paper docs. And as I was like putting this together, we realized that, hey, you shouldn't be getting this piece of info here. Maybe we should gate it or something. Or maybe if you're getting this piece of info here, maybe we should react to that in this or that place. So that was really good. It was surprisingly good at simulating speedrunning because you could do a lot of iterations at a very fast pace. You could play a little bit with the tool and optimize your way through the game and just tick all the right boxes at all the right times. And that was very useful for game designers and level designers, and just get an overall vision of the project and how long how quickly you can make it. And so this informed some of the decisions. It turned out to be a pretty good support for writing because you have this player-facing text. And we decided, hey, we have all those ideas how to phrase some of those things. So maybe let's put them in the prototype and see how people react to it. And that turned out to be super good. So it helped us make decisions about how we were going to write some things. And because we had a bunch of players who were playing with this prototype, Twine lets you collect some of the information. So you can see which nodes were accessed in which order and which options were selected, etc. So that was very useful. So we could see that, okay, so a lot of people are hitting this beat of the story, but not many people are getting this thing. So maybe we should put more content there and less content there. It was very good. And so this prototype proved to be so useful in a variety of places that actually it prompted some revisions of the design of the game. And ironically, that's what made the whole prototype obsolete, because at some point there were so many changes in the game that the tool was no longer relevant. It would take a lot of time to update it, so we just threw it away. So my lessons from this prototype were that you should start simple and you should keep it simple if you can. But if you see the potential for, if you add a little complexity, you could maybe get a lot of mileage out of that prototype. And sometimes spending a little more time than you would normally on a feature prototype or a gameplay prototype can actually be good. So that was an important lesson. It showed that if you start with a very simple thing and then layer in more stuff, it's an approach that you can break off at any moment. If you try to start big and put all of the different options immediately, then the time between the start of the prototype and when it starts becoming useful is longer, and you should try to minimize that time. So you should have something useful as quickly as you can, and then you can put in more things. And if even though you have a very useful prototype, if it becomes a pain to update it constantly and keep it up to date, etc., just let it go. So that was the other prototype, and the interesting thing was that these prototypes were useful not just for the narrative team. So on both projects, I got feedback from quality assurance guys that these prototypes were actually useful for them as well, as reference, as And at some, like if you extrapolate this, it could, if you start your prototype early, it could be the very first look at the complete structure of the game that QA is going to get in some sort of, testable interactive form, because levels and systems, they only come together late in the project, and this may be inconvenient for QA to have this information so late. If they can get like an idea of how this game is going to evolve and just fiddle with the tool and see how it works, they can make some decisions based on that. Same for localization. So localization actually comes late in the project usually, but they don't usually have access to your game. They cannot play the game and get a sense of like what the game is. But if you have this prototype and it's like not completely outdated, and it still gives you some sort of idea of how the game is going to play, well, maybe you can give them that, and they would get an idea of, okay, so there's this bit and this part, and this thing is going to look a bit like that. So yeah, for narrative, beyond what the prototype was designed for, like in our case, it was very helpful for writing and testing, some of the writing on people, and we got a lot of content metrics from other people interacting with the prototype. So that was very useful, and we didn't expect that at all. And systems designers, as I mentioned before, they just because the prototype simulates the whole game experience, we had systems designers who like drew some of their feedback and their metrics from this prototype, which was completely unexpected as well. And last but not least, if you're working in a big company and there are a lot of people of various disciplines working together, and they have their own problems to worry about, and they are maybe stuck writing a render, or skinning your characters, or just doing anything where they do like a specialized slice of the work, which is extremely important, but they don't really have time to like go through the game, play it, and see what works like and what it looks like. Such a quick prototype that you can like send over and people can get a little fun with it. It just might be like a reminder of get people on the same page and say like, hey, this is the game that we're making. So this is non-negligible as well. And now let's look at how we can make one. How I could sum up this approach for you to make your own prototype of this type. So find the right tool first. Like I said, should be a tool that you're familiar with, or a tool that is so easy to learn that you can learn it. There's plenty of storytelling tools out there, and Twine is just one example. You can have Enkel, which is sort of the same idea, but maybe actually, like an Unreal script where you just click through some windows could also work. There's plenty of options really. When you have your tool, start designing the prototype. And the way the way I went about this, and it worked pretty well, was you identify the elements that influence the narrative. So what kind of gameplay elements or what kind of properties of the game inform the narrative? Is it like passage of time? Is this specific action, specific mission? Just identify all the factors that could influence the narrative content that you're displaying for the player. Then you create the controls for these elements. So enable the user of the prototype to alter these values as they need. And based on that, see how it influences the narrative content, and then output the content to the user. This is basically the idea. So then you populate the prototype with some content. Just keep it very simple. It doesn't have to be any final writing. You can just literally drop a sentence and it could be enough. And then if you need to test some content, you could try and put in some actual stuff. If that's useful, but you don't really need to for this prototype to work. And don't try to do everything at once. Like I said, start with a first very basic iteration of this, and then layer in more stuff. If you find out maybe script just a piece of the game and see if that works, just the first chapter, for instance. And if that works, then you extrapolate with the rest. You add the rest of the content. But if it turns out that it doesn't work, well, you can quickly throw the prototype in the bin, and you haven't lost much time. And while you're using the prototype and you are sharing it with a team and have other people, interact with it, you will begin to see what the prototype does well and what it doesn't do that well. So anything that it does well, you should support and you should develop, and anything that it doesn't do well, you can get rid of. So we should probably take a look at one thing. So I made retroactively a prototype of Far Cry 5. So I used Twine again. It took me about an hour to do everything that you will see. So it was pretty fast. And this is in no way how Deathloop works, in case you were wondering. This is really, and I haven't worked on Far Cry 5 either. This is just me analyzing what the narrative in that game works like and trying to put it back, like reverse engineer it to put in fine form. So I will now try to switch. Yeah, success. So this is, you can see the Twine screen here, and you can see all the different nodes that are, and they're of course connected one to another in different ways. So you start with a starting node where I set up all my variables, and they're just default values. And there's a very short description of the initial scene where you confront the cult and the antagonist. And you have two options, same as you are offered in the game. So you can handcuff the guy and this kickstarts the whole game, the whole campaign, or you can just walk away, which is a way to the secret ending. And here's a note for the secret ending. If you attempt to arrest the guy, by the way, spoiler alert, I guess, but it's an old game, so hopefully it won't be that bad. So the next node is the description of the tutorial. It's very basic. It doesn't have any details. And starting from the tutorial, you pick a region where there are 3 regions, of course, in Far Cry 5, and each contains like a host of missions, etc. So just pick one. I only did actually one region of the 3. I didn't think it would be necessary to do more. And within the region, there is, as you can see, no description there at all. Just displays your resistance points, and resistance points are the more you get, the closer you get to a narrative event. If you have the right amount, it triggers some narrative events, and you can perform various actions. So I didn't list any specific actions. They're just categories, just to keep it as simple as possible. So you can do a story mission that gives you a certain amount of resistance points. You can do a side mission, which gives you another amount. And you can do major, minor actions. It all gives you some points. So in these nodes for each action, I'm adding a certain value to your resistance points count, and this is just an integer that I just increase by a certain number. And then I go back to a node that checks your progress. So it checks if you're in a given region and you have accumulated set amount of resistance points, and this is bigger than the threshold that triggers a narrative event, and this narrative event has not yet triggered, which are all just very simple, booleans and integers, then we go to a specific narrative event, or if you haven't, then we just go back to your to the region node where you can perform more actions and get more points. And I also added a variable that calculates the time, which the time of play, which I will talk about when we look at the example. So now I launched the script, and you can see the description of what is happening. So this is this initial scene. If you walk away, then game over. Thank you. We can restart the game. So this time we're gonna arrest the guy as we're told to, and we go through the tutorial, and we pick the first region where we can pick. So I have 0 resistance points. Nothing of note narratively is happening. So I'm going to start with a minor action like releasing a prisoner or something. And I got 50 resistance points. Then I maybe do like a side mission, so liberating an outpost or something. And I get like 300 more points. This is still not enough to trigger any narrative events. So I'm going for a big mission. I did a big mission. We have 950. So you can see how this resistance points counter is increasing. This is something that you also are able to see in the game. I do another side mission, and then I've reached a threshold which triggers an event. So I go to a different node, and I got the information that, like a message on the radio that warns me against the cult. And I can just proceed to do other missions, or I can maybe switch regions, which would be something that you can do in the game as well. And I've done another story mission, and this has increased. I've hit the second threshold, and you get this big narrative sequence where your character is being hunted and disabled, and then you wake up and you're in captivity, and then you get those close encounters with the antagonists and their henchmen. And this is how the story progresses in that game, more or less. Of course, it's a bit more complex than that, but for the for the needs of this prototype, this is enough. So I added this debug command because this is also something that we realized on Deathloop, that if you assign a time value to every action that you do, it will give you an approximation of how long it takes to hit certain narrative points. So I'm going now to activate the timer, and as you can see, there's a new piece of information here. It's not just resistance points, but also how many minutes I spent in that game. So you can see that after roughly 3 hours of the game, I hit the first encounter with the antagonist, and that informs the pacing. I can see, okay, so is this encounter quickly enough, or maybe this is happening too fast? I can continue playing, just rack up more points, and just see how fast I can progress in this game. Or, and then the narrative designers can decide, like, okay, this is maybe too fast, or this is maybe we were thinking about making it a little slower. So that's basically how this prototype works. As you can see, it's very basic, but it gives you a lot of information. Then you could expand this. You could add more actions. You could add additional, conditions and make it more granular and just profile it in a way that to get the information that you need. So that's it. Okay, so we're back with our, and let's conclude this. So takeaways, this is just a summary of everything that we've discussed. So start small and either do a minimum viable product, and then layer in additional features, or just script a first part, like a part of the game, see if this prototype works, see if this philosophy that you've come up with works. If yes, then do the rest. Make sure your prototype is user-friendly, and if it takes too long to make, maybe some of these things are wrong. And if the prototype becomes a nuisance to update and to maintain, then just don't worry about throwing it away. It's done its job. Move on. Let's review the properties of prototypes that we've listed at the beginning. So should this prototype be cheap? Yes, definitely. This is totally valid, and you should be fast. Yes, but you know, sometimes you can add more stuff which will make the prototype, you know, you will develop the prototype longer, but it will give you a lot of additional information that you wouldn't have gotten otherwise, or if you were trying to do a separate prototype to test this other bit of info. But of course, it won't take forever. And should you use familiar tech? Definitely, just pick something that is easy to use for you or that you can learn very quickly. Should it be focused? Again, yes. You design it to answer a specific question, but maybe you can get like emergent uses that will warrant additional expansion. So you will get more features, and therefore your prototype is less focused on a single thing, but it's easier to do it this way than do separate prototypes. And of course, enough is enough. So in conclusion, I found these prototypes to be extremely useful, even the ones that weren't very good, like the front-end Doctrine one, which was like the first version, very basic, not really, you know, user-friendly or anything, but it was still very useful, and I'm glad that I had it. So this may not be this kind of overall overarching story prototype is not necessarily your usual gameplay or system prototype. You can maybe bend some of the rules if this is convenient, but don't ignore red flags. These prototypes are not just for narrative designers. So be flexible. Think about the other guys. Ask other people. Share your prototype with the team and see if anybody else is any use for it. Maybe they can take yours as basis and develop the rest on their own to find out more stuff that they need. But of course, don't overdo it. And this is my time. Thank you very much, and I hope I'll see you at the live Q&A session. Bye.